What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. As you can see behind me here is the Mazda B2000 truck. I didn't abandon it. After I did the engine swap, I kind of left it sitting for a while. But anyway, we're back at the truck. We're gonna upgrade the truck and give all new components on the truck and make it look as nice as possible. The first thing we're gonna do is actually slam the truck with all new suspension component by DJM. So we have a 3-inch drop for the rear. We also have all new shocks for the front and the back. And we also have new lower control arm right here by DJM as well. So I can't wait to put this on, so let's get started. Okay, so the first step before we lower the truck is to actually get a measurement of all 4 corners. And DJM actually give this sheet right here that you can mark the before and after on all 4 corners. What you want to do is measure from the top of the fender and then to the center of the wheel cap, like so, and then just kind of mark it down. Okay, so here's the front driver suspension. As you can see, it's an old truck, so the best thing to do is actually lubricate it down before we actually work on it. And also I want to mention the torsion rod, which is right here. So before we actually take this apart, we have to mark it down to where it lines up. So I got my small little cutter right here. I'm just going to use it to mark it down. So there you go, that's my little mark. I'm also swapping all these steering components, so I'm going to lubricate it down as well. Also, a side note, I will be replacing a lot of the parts. You don't have to do that if you're just replacing the lower control arm, but just a side note, if you're seeing these parts removed, that's because I'm replacing that part. All right, so I lubricate everything already. The first thing I'm going to do is take the sway link off, and it's held on by a 17 millimeter. Okay, to remove the caliper, there's 2 bolts holding it down. Right here in the back is one of them, and it's another one. These are 21 millimeter bolts. And now the caliper can come out. Now's a good time to just tie this somewhere so the brake line doesn't get mangled up. I'm also going to remove the heat shield right here. You don't have to remove yours, but I'm just going to remove mine so it's a lot easier to clean the wheels. Okay, now if you're working on the ground, now's a good time to jack up the suspension up a little bit more so it relieves some tension off the bolts. Now we're going to remove that shock bottom bolt, and also you can remove these as well if you were trying to replace the bushing, as well as these bolt down here for the lower control arm bushing. Okay, next we got to remove the top shock bolts. There's 2 nuts up in place sandwiched together. You got to remove the top one and then remove the bottom one, and all these bushings should be able to come out. All right. There's the bushing. And as you can see, we're not going to be able to pull the shock out until we disconnect these bolts and pivot the upper control arm out of the way. Like I said earlier, make sure you jack up the suspension because the suspension is under load right now with the torsion rod. So I was very careful, able to take it out, and now we can remove the shock. If you're planning to remove your lower ball joint, now's a good time to do so. These are 14 millimeter bolts. If you look along the torsion bar all the way to the back right here, you'll see there's a 17 millimeter bolt where we could use to release the tension off the torsion bar. Okay, we're pretty much at the home stretch. Looking at the bottom, there's a bar right here that goes across, and there's actually two bolts here. One bolt's actually broken. Not a big deal. We're going to replace the control arm anyway and put a new bolt in there. But just be very careful. They can break because they get rusty. And also there's two bolts on the side right here for the torsion bar. We loosen it as much as we can right there. So there's not a lot of preload on there now. And also we're going to have to remove this big gigantic bolt as well. Okay, again, I want to make note, before you remove these torsion rod out, you have to mark it to where it lines up. So that way, when you put it back together, it lines up to where it should be. And lastly, we got to take this last bolt out. Make sure you have a pry bar. It's a 24 millimeter. And now the lower control arm should be able to come out. So that wasn't too bad, right? Now just make sure you do exactly the same thing on the other side. Also the sway arms and the link is out of the way. And now we're ready to modify this bump stop. So what I'm going to do is actually cut about as high as possible, but leaving a little bit of bushing left for the bump stop, so it doesn't bottom out and hit metal to metal. So yeah, we're just going to cut a little bit of that. Also, you can remove the whole bump stop if you wanted to do that. There's a bolt on top. Okay, what we have here is the lower control arm and of course the front shock. And we're going to assemble the lower control arm. First thing we need to do is actually put the ball joint in there. And there's two ways to do it. You could mount it to the bottom like a factory, or you can mount it on top. If you wanted to lower it a little bit more, you could do either or is fine. I'm just going to mount it mine like the factory because I don't need to slam the car too much. Also, it comes with these 4 bolts right here. These 4 bolts are actually for the bottom hole right here. The next thing is for the shock. The shock has these 3 fittings right here. I believe they made these shocks to fit a bunch of different cars, so they supply you with these 3 fittings. We only need to use one of them, which is one of the sleeve with the bigger hole. We're going to use that because that sleeve is going to go right between the bolt and the nut of the factory hardware. So it's going to go right between here. When we put the shock in, it goes right through that. The next thing is to remember, we're going to insert these factory hardware right here on the long bolt. It's going to go right between the middle hole right here. And lastly, to put the shock together, it comes with these bushing. So how it works is that you put the sleeve or the washer in first, like so. Then you want to put the rubber bushing. If you look at the back of the bushing, there's actually a raised edge. Just make sure you put the smaller raised edge toward the middle. So now after the smaller raised edge is toward the middle, it's going to sandwich it into the car. Then we're going to do the same with the next bushing, like so. In between here is the car. And now we're going to put the top washer and then with the nut. And now use the sleeve with the bigger hole, insert that into the lower part of the shock. All right, as you can see, the spindle right here is clean, so I clean as best I can. Got all the grease out. We're gonna put new grease on there anyway. Next thing we're gonna do is actually install this top ball joint because it's easier to have access here now than later. So it's going to go up on top like that. All right, let's talk about the torsion bar. As you can see, I got the torsion bar here. Hopefully you listened to me in the beginning of the video that to mark the torsion bar with this shaft right here, you have to mark them because we're going to re-index the torsion bar, meaning we're going to take it out, spin it, rotate it a few notch, and put it back together. So it's very tricky, kind of like play around with it. It's more like a trial and error kind of thing. So what I'm going to do is just re-index this to about 2 notch, and hopefully that works. All right, now it's time to install the parts. I'm going to install the shock in first. Make sure you put the bushing on. I'm just going to hand tighten all the bolts right now. Okay, now we're going to install the lower control arm. You're going to have to push the shock inward or upward. And now we can insert the bolt for the shock mount. And just hand tighten it. Next, we're going to push the control arm up again to compress the shock. And then we're going to put the long bolt on the back. And again, just kind of tighten everything by hand. Now we're ready to install the spindle. We got to line it with the ball joint on the bottom and the top. Before we install the spindle, we got to move our caliper to this side. Okay, to install the spindle, you have 3 bolts on the top right here and the ball joint right here. So you got to kind of line them all together. And if you need help, it's good to jack the bottom of the control arm upward to mount straight into here. All right, so I'm gonna hand tighten the bottom ball joint. And now we can hand tighten the top ball joint. Okay, now that everything is mounted, now we have to mount the torsion bar on the bottom. Now we're going to put the sway link in place. You're probably going to need a jack to lift the arm up. So I'm going to use a jack right now. Make sure you put the bushing and then insert through the hole. And put the top bushing in. And lastly, the bolt. Okay, next we got to insert these bolts right here. So DGM actually provides us with this locking nut right here. But the problem with that is that it will not fit the OEM bolt that goes up here because they're different thread size. So I went ahead and bought my own bolt. This is a 12 millimeter by, the pitch is 1.75. These are about 50 millimeter in length, or you could do 40 millimeter, it should fit fine. And we got to line it up with the bolt on the lower control arm. Like so. And then I'm just going to hand tighten the nut. Then I'm going to do the same with the nut and bolt on the other side. And slide it in. All right, since now all the bolts are in place and everything is snugly tightened, next thing you want to do is actually jack up the suspension, put it on the load. And now we can tighten all the bolts to factory spec. Okay, to finish the install, you don't have to install new rotors and wheel bearings. I'm just doing this because it's already out, But if you want to follow along, just follow along. Otherwise, you can move on to the next step. To remove the rotors, you just have to take these 6 bolts out, which is 14 millimeters. Mine's already loose. And next, you want to flip this over. And if your rotors are pretty stuck, you just want to lightly tap it with the hammer all around. And it should pop out. Now next, we're going to have to push out the race for the bearing. There's also a seal right here. To get the seal out, you just need a flathead and just kind of poke it in the bottom and pry it out. So you just want to do it all in one take. You want to hold it tightly. Sometimes you might want to tap this side to get it to loosen up. There you go. Once you tap it, it pushes the seal out. Now we have to punch the race out of the hub itself. And to do so, Mazda made a little notch right here. You have to clean the grease off because it's really nasty right now. You won't be able to see until you clean the grease off. So I feel the groove right here. I'm going to punch it out with the hammer. And you want to punch it in opposite direction. There should be a groove on each side. Just take your time because it will take some time. And there you go, it's out. And here's the first race. And now we got to flip it over and do the same with the other side of the race. And there we have it. Now you want to keep your bearing race because we're going to use this to punch the new bearing in. So don't throw this away yet. Now before we install the new bearing, I suggest you clean as much grease, get this old gunk out of there as much as possible because we're putting on all new grease. Okay, now we're ready to install the new race onto the hub itself. Before we do that, we want to lubricate it, get some kind of oil, and just kind of squirt a little bit of oil to let it slide easier in there. We're going to do the same on the other side. We want to install it with the little lip right here on the bottom. And you want to evenly push it in lightly. Now we're going to take the old bearing race and we're going to lay it right on top. So now we can hammer it down lightly. And you want to hammer in opposite direction each time. Now you just need to go down a little bit more. I won't be using this now. You can use it like a socket. And again, do the same exact thing, just hammer in opposite direction. Lightly, just to push it down a little bit more and we're done. Now we're going to do the same on the other side. All right, now we have to install the new bearing. Before we install the new bearing, we have to grease it up and we have to apply grease either by hand or you can use a special tool to push the grease from the back in here outward to the front. I have a tool called a bearing packer. So you put the bearing inside here and put the lid on. And now we could use a grease gun to push the bearing from through here and outside from there. And once you see the grease flowing out from the bottom, that's mean your bearing is packed. And look, and there you go, look how packed the grease is. Now what you want to do is get a little bit of grease right here and just grease this whole piece up right here. Next, we're going to install the bearing. And lastly, we're going to install the seal and then do the same on the other side. Right here, I got my old seal. I'm going to flip it upside down, lay it on top, and then just install the seal like so. Lightly tap it in opposite direction. And next, we're going to install the rotors. So line it up as best as you can. Then insert the bolt. For the front side, we're not going to install the bearing yet. We're going to wait till we get into the car, and then we'll install the bearing. All right, for the next step, make sure you grease up the shaft very good. Just put a lot of grease on it. You want the bearing to have as much grease as possible. Also, you could put your heat shield back in if you want to. I'm going to leave mine out. Make sure you line it up perfectly. It doesn't hit the bearing. Again, make sure you grease up the bearing before you install it. Now we can put the washer. Make sure you put the notch on top. Now we can put the nut. This is a 24mm nut. Now we're ready to tighten this nut. From the factory, they recommend 2.5 foot-pounds. It's not much, so it's like a little snug. I'm just going to go with that. That's about it. Now we can put this cover on right here and insert the cotter pin. Then lastly, we're going to put the cap on. And next we're going to put the caliper back in. Okay, now we're ready to install the brake bracket with the pad on. Now we can install the caliper. And lastly, you want to install the tie rod, which is right here. I'm not going to install mine yet because they sent me a wrong pitman arm, which I need for the steering. So once that arrives, I'll install it, but you should install yours. And now we're off to the next step. Before we get started, make sure you have a jack and a jack stand on the rear, because once we loosen all the bolt, this bottom piece is going to just collapse. So make sure you have a jack on there. I tend to like to jack mine somewhere in between the front and the back of the pumpkin because it tends to tilt forward or tilt down. So in the middle somewhere right there is like a good spot for it. So this is a 17. Next step is to remove these 4 nuts right here that's holding the spring in place. These tend to rust pretty bad. So if you can't get yours out, you can just cut these bar right here because it comes with all new hardware anyway. So we don't really need these. Now we can remove the hardware and the bump stop. We could also remove the shock, which is a 17mm hardware. Okay, now you want to do the same on the other side. All right, so now here's the 2 bump stop. Some people remove this completely, but what I'm going to do with mine is just cut a little bit off the top. So that way, when it does bottom out, it hits a little rubber piece instead of a bare metal. Okay, now we got to raise the differential up high enough so we could slide the lowering block on each side. Before we install the lowering block, make sure the hole is on the bottom. If yours has a slant on it, this means the slant is facing the front. Now we can put the bump stop. Okay, I'm just going to tighten this by hand for now until we get the other one lined up. Okay, now we're going to do the same on this side. Make sure the hole's on the bottom. I'm just going to raise it up with my hand and slide it in. And then make sure the hole is centered in. There you go. Once it's in place, we can now install the long bolts. Again, I'm going to just lightly tighten everything by hand. Make sure everything lines up before I tighten it down. So the rear shock does come with these sleeves. We're not going to use them. They're for other vehicles. We're just going to install the shock. So now we're ready to install the shock. You're going to have to compress it down a little bit. Okay, now that everything's in place, all the bolt lines up, we're ready to tighten everything down to factory spec. I'm going to start with the shocks first, and then I'm going to tighten the bottom bolt. Also, don't forget, put a little bit of preload on your suspension before you tighten all the bolts. All right, guys, it's been a few days now and the truck is back on the ground. As you can see right here, I have my 3-inch lowering block. I decided to take this off and upgrade to a 4-inch lowering block. So now there's a 4-inch lowering block on the rear of the car. It just brings the truck down a little bit more compared to the 3-inch one. And if you want to go lower than that, you can remove some of the leaf spring off the truck. It brings it down even more. So now we're going to check the measurement to see how low we went from stock to what it is now. Okay, so here's my cheat sheet from last time, and we're looking at the driver rear. What I have before is 18-inch and a quarter. So now we have about 16-inch from the bottom of the fender. And we're at the driver front now. Before it was 17-inch. And now we're at about 14 and 3/4. I could raise it or lower it a little bit more depending on the torsion bar. All right, guys, this is a wrap for this video. But on the next video, we're going to modify the exterior of this truck. We're going to make it look as good as possible. So please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you on the next video.
Hyper Speed Media